On a quiet ridge above the rolling hills of Spring Green, Wisconsin, a house once stood that did not belong to its time. It did not rise like the marble palaces of Newport, nor did it glitter with chandeliers imported from Paris. There were no gilded ballrooms, no European turrets, no attempt to mimic the aristocracy of another continent. Instead, in 1911, a long, low structure stretched across the crest of the hill, built of local limestone and stucco, its rooflines echoing the horizon itself. It was called Taliesin, and from the moment it appeared, it was an act of defiance. The Gilded Age had taught America's wealthy to build upward, to dominate the landscape, to proclaim power in stone and ornament. Mansions were meant to impress, to intimidate, to imitate Europe's ancient bloodlines. But Frank Lloyd Wright rejected all of it. Taliesin did not conquer the hill, it seemed to grow from it. Its horizontal lines followed the contours of the earth. Its terraces opened toward the valley. The house did not shout, it whispered. And in that whisper was a revolution. Wright was already known as a brilliant architect, a leading voice of the Prairie School, a man who believed that American architecture should be truly American, rooted in its own soil rather than borrowed from Europe's past. But Taliesin was different from his earlier works. This was not a commission for a wealthy client. This was personal. This was his statement. Built on land once settled by his Welsh ancestors, Taliesin was meant to be both refuge and manifesto, a place where art, nature, and life would merge into one seamless philosophy. Yet from the beginning, there was tension in its walls. In 1911, America was a nation obsessed with propriety and appearances. Industrial fortunes were guarded by strict codes of behavior. Reputation was currency, and Taliesin stood in quiet opposition to that world. It was modern not just in design but in spirit. Open interiors replaced rigid Victorian rooms. Light flowed freely. Boundaries dissolved. It was architecture that suggested freedom. Intellectual freedom, artistic freedom, even moral freedom. To some, it was genius. To others, it was arrogance. From the valley below, locals could see the house resting confidently on the hill, its long balconies catching the sun. It was beautiful, undeniably so. But it was also strange. There was something unsettling about a home that refused to resemble the great estates of the era. It did not fit into the American narrative of wealth and legacy. It did not aspire to old money grandeur. Instead, it suggested a new kind of power, one rooted in ideas rather than inheritance. Taliesin was more than a house. It was an argument carved into stone. It challenged how America built, how it lived, and even how it loved. And in doing so, it made enemies long before tragedy ever struck. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is not scandal or violence, but a vision too far ahead of its time. Before Taliesin was a house, it was an escape. And before it was an escape, it was a scandal. In 1909, Frank Lloyd Wright was at the height of his early fame. He was 42 years old, celebrated in architectural circles, married to Catherine Tobin Wright, and the father of 6 children. His Oak Park home and studio had become the center of the Prairie School movement. Wealthy Midwestern clients sought him out not only for houses, but for a new identity, modern, cultured, distinctly American. From the outside, he embodied the very stability and success that defined professional respectability in the early 20th century. But inside that carefully arranged life, something had begun to fracture. It began with a commission. Edwin Cheney, a prosperous engineer from Oak Park, hired Wright to design a home. Through that project, Wright met Cheney's wife, Mama Borthwick Cheney. She was not a typical society wife of the era. Educated, intellectually curious, fluent in languages, she had studied at the University of Michigan and was deeply interested in literature and progressive thought. In Wright, she found not merely an architect, but a mind that mirrored her own restlessness. In Mama, Wright found something he increasingly believed he lacked: intellectual companionship and emotional intensity. What followed was not a quiet indiscretion, it was a rupture. By 1909, Wright made a decision that stunned Oak Park society. He left his wife and children and traveled to Europe with Mama Cheney. Both were still legally married. There were no discreet arrangements, no attempt to soften the blow. Newspapers quickly seized on the story. Headlines framed it as moral collapse, as evidence of artistic arrogance turned personal corruption. Wright was painted not as a visionary, but as a man who had abandoned duty for desire. In a nation still deeply rooted in Victorian codes of marriage and family, the outrage was swift and unforgiving. For Catherine Wright, the humiliation was public and devastating. For Edwin Cheney, it was equally scandalous. Divorce in that era carried stigma. Adultery carried exile. Oak Park, once Wright's professional sanctuary, became hostile territory. Clients withdrew. Social invitations vanished. Churches denounced him. The man who had designed homes that symbolized domestic harmony had shattered his own. Europe offered temporary anonymity. Wright and Mama traveled through Germany and Italy, studying architecture and living abroad, while Wright oversaw the publication of his Wasmuth portfolio, a collection of his designs that would later influence modernist architects across Europe. Professionally, his ideas were gaining international traction. Personally, he was becoming an outcast at home. But exile could not last forever. Wright needed a place to return to, a place outside the reach of Oak Park's judgment, outside Chicago's whispers. He chose land in the Wisconsin countryside near Spring Green, where his mother's Welsh family had once settled. The rolling hills, shaped by ancient glaciers, carried a sense of ancestral belonging. If society rejected him, he would build his own world. Taliesin was conceived in that defiance. The name itself was symbolic. Taliesin was a legendary Welsh bard, a poet whose name meant shining brow. Wright saw himself in that mythology, an artist misunderstood, perhaps even persecuted, yet destined to create something transcendent. Building on his family's land allowed him to reclaim narrative control. This was not escape in hiding, it was escape through creation. Construction began in 1911. While America's wealthy erected mansions to signal status, Wright built a home that signaled ideology. Taliesin would not mimic European estates. It would not imitate Newport's marble extravagance. It would stretch low and long across the hill, aligned with the horizon. It would embody prairie principles, organic architecture, harmony with nature, fluid interior spaces. It would be both residence and laboratory. Yet Taliesin was never just about architecture. It was about rewriting the rules of living. Wright and Mama moved into the house together, though neither was immediately divorced. That fact alone fueled further scandal. Newspapers referred to Taliesin as a love nest. Reporters lingered at the edge of the property hoping for glimpses. The rural setting did not shield them from scrutiny, it amplified it. In small-town Wisconsin, the presence was a spectacle. Spring Green was not accustomed to avant-garde architects and controversial intellectuals living openly outside conventional marriage. Locals observed the couple with a mixture of curiosity and moral suspicion. Wright, already known for his confidence, some called it arrogance, did little to soften perceptions. He believed that the institution of marriage, as structured in his time, constrained individuality. He spoke openly about personal freedom, about living truthfully rather than conforming to social expectations. To admirers, this was progressive. To critics, it was self-justification. The irony was impossible to ignore. Wright designed houses that emphasized family unity, open gathering spaces, hearth-centered living. Yet his own family life lay fractured miles away in Oak Park. His children grew up largely without him. Catherine refused for years to grant a divorce, prolonging the legal and emotional entanglement. The tension between Wright's architectural philosophy and his personal choices became a source of relentless commentary. Still, within Taliesin's walls, Wright and Mama attempted to construct something genuine. She pursued her intellectual work, translating the writings of Swedish feminist Ellen Key. He sketched, planned, and refined new designs. The house became a retreat for artists and thinkers, a quiet enclave where conversations stretched into the night. In many ways, Taliesin functioned as a prototype for the later Taliesin Fellowship, a blending of life, work, and artistic community. But even in its serenity, the house carried the weight of controversy. Every stone had been laid in the shadow of public judgment. Every window opened onto a valley where whispers traveled faster than wind. Wright may have believed he was building above society, but he was still visible from below. Financial strain added another layer of vulnerability. Wright's reputation had suffered in the United States. While he still received commissions, the steady stream of elite Midwestern clients had slowed. Maintaining Taliesin required resources, staff, and constant attention. The sanctuary was not isolated from economic reality. And beneath the surface calm, something more intangible lingered: the cost of reinvention. To leave one life entirely and begin another is never clean. Wright had not simply changed addresses. He had severed identities. Husband, father, respected suburban professional. Those roles no longer fit neatly. In their place stood the image of the romantic rebel architect, living unconventionally on a hill. It was an image both alluring and dangerous. The more he embodied it, the harder it became to retreat. Taliesin, then, was not merely a physical refuge. It was a wager. Wright bet that genius could outweigh scandal, that vision could silence criticism, that time would vindicate him. He believed that history would remember the architecture, not the outrage. For a few years, it seemed possible. The hills were quiet. The house glowed warmly against Wisconsin sunsets. Visitors spoke of its beauty, of the way rooms unfolded naturally into terraces and gardens. It felt like a new beginning carved into ancient land. But beginnings built on upheaval are fragile. The scandal that drove Wright to Wisconsin did not disappear. It settled into the foundation. The isolation that offered privacy also magnified tensions. The house that symbolized freedom also embodied defiance. And defiance, in an era defined by rigid moral codes, carried consequences that could not yet be seen. Taliesin rose from love and rebellion, from intellectual partnership and personal rupture. It stood as proof that Wright would rather construct a new world than conform to the old one. Yet the very forces that inspired its creation, passion, ego, resistance to convention, would shape everything that followed. Because Taliesin was not simply born from modern ideals. It was born from scandal. And scandal, once ignited, rarely burns quietly. When Taliesin began to take physical form in 1911, it was not designed as a mansion in the way America understood mansions. There were no grand staircases meant to impress arriving guests, no gilded ceilings painted with allegories of conquest, no imported marble shipped across the Atlantic to announce cultural allegiance to Europe. Instead, Frank Lloyd Wright conceived something radically different, an architectural philosophy made visible, a house that did not dominate the land but seemed to emerge from it. In an era still echoing with the excesses of the Gilded Age, Taliesin was a quiet rebellion carved into a Wisconsin hillside. Wright called his approach organic architecture. To him, buildings were not objects placed upon the earth, but organisms that belonged to it. At Taliesin, the limestone was quarried from the surrounding hills. The color palette echoed the grasses and soil. The long horizontal lines of the structure paralleled the horizon, as if the house were an extension of the prairie itself. This was not coincidence, it was intention. Wright believed American architecture should reflect American landscapes, not European palaces. Taliesin, perched above the valley near Spring Green, embodied that belief with uncompromising clarity. The layout itself rejected the rigid compartmentalization of Victorian homes. Instead of narrow hallways and sealed-off parlors, Talien's featured flowing interior spaces. Rooms opened into one another. Windows stretched outward in bands, dissolving the boundary between inside and outside. Light moved freely through the house, shifting with the hours. Terraces extended living spaces into the open air. It was architecture that encouraged movement rather than ceremony, conversation rather than performance. In this sense, Taliesin was not simply modern in appearance, it was modern in spirit. But modernity, in 1911, was a controversial language. The American elite of the late 19th and early 20th centuries had expressed wealth through imitation. The Vanderbilts built chateaux inspired by the Loire Valley. The Astors commissioned Italianate villas. Grandeur meant replication of Europe's aristocratic past. Taliesin refused that lineage entirely. It did not bow to Versailles or Florence. It bowed to the Wisconsin hills. For some observers, this was refreshing. For others, it seemed like an intentional rejection of established taste, a refusal to participate in the social grammar of prestige. Wright was fully aware of this tension. He believed architecture should shape the way people lived, not simply frame it. At Taliesin, he experimented constantly. The house was not static. It evolved as he revised plans, extended wings, adjusted sightlines. He treated it as a living laboratory. Even the placement of the building on the hill was deliberate. Rather than placing it at the peak to assert dominance, Wright nestled it just below the crest, so it appeared sheltered, protected from harsh winds, integrated into the slope. He once said that no house should ever be on a hill. It should be of the hill. Taliesin became the clearest expression of that principle. Yet beneath the architectural innovation lay a deeper statement. Taliesin was designed for a new way of life, one that blurred boundaries between work, art, and domesticity. Wright's studio spaces were integrated into the residence. Drafting tables stood near living quarters. Gardens were not ornamental afterthoughts but essential extensions of the house's rhythm. The environment encouraged creativity at all hours. There was no rigid separation between professional identity and personal existence. In that integration, Wright was quietly challenging the industrial age's compartmentalized worldview. Mama Borthwick Cheney's presence reinforced this intellectual atmosphere. Taliesin was not merely a romantic refuge. It was a shared experiment in progressive living. Conversations about literature, philosophy, and social reform unfolded within its walls. Mama's translations of feminist writer Ellen Key's works reflected a belief in personal freedom and the evolution of social norms. The house became a stage for ideas that unsettled conventional morality. Architecture and ideology intertwined seamlessly. To visitors, Taliesin felt unlike any other residence. Approaching it required winding roads and gradual ascent. There was no dramatic reveal of towering columns. Instead, the house unfolded slowly, revealing itself in segments, rooflines, terraces, low stone walls. The entrance did not overwhelm, it invited. Interiors felt intimate despite their openness. Built-in furniture, another hallmark of Wright's design, created cohesion between structure and decor. Nothing felt accidental, everything belonging. But belonging in this case came at a cost. Spring Green was rural, conservative, and deeply rooted in traditional values. The sight of this unconventional house, paired with the scandal that had accompanied its construction, made Taliesin more than an architectural curiosity. It became a symbol of defiance. While Wright saw harmony with nature, some locals saw arrogance. While he spoke of organic unity, critics saw moral disorder. The house's very existence suggested a different hierarchy of values, one where artistic conviction outweighed social approval. Financially, Taliesin was also an ambitious undertaking. Built largely with Wright's own funds during a period of professional instability, it required confidence bordering on audacity. The materials were local, but the design complexity demanded skilled labor. Wright oversaw details obsessively, ensuring that proportions, textures, and sightlines aligned with his vision. It was not a speculative investment, it was an assertion of identity. Every beam and window declared that he would define his legacy on his own terms. Inside, daily life unfolded against this backdrop of experimentation. Meals were shared overlooking sweeping views of the valley. Evenings were lit by carefully placed fixtures that emphasized warmth rather than grandeur. Taliesin's hearth, central to Wright's philosophy of home, anchored the interior. Fireplaces were not decorative but symbolic, the heart of communal life. Yet there was an irony embedded in that symbolism. The same architect who centered domestic unity in his designs had fractured his own family to create this space. The contradiction lingered in the air. Taliesin was forward-looking, but it was also vulnerable. Its sprawling layout, constructed in stages, included wooden elements that required careful maintenance. Its isolation meant reliance on a small staff and limited oversight. The very qualities that made it experimental also made it fragile. It was a masterpiece of vision, but not immune to human unpredictability. Still, in those early years, Taliesin radiated possibility. Visitors described sunsets that seemed to dissolve into the limestone walls, mornings when mist rose from the valley and blurred the boundary between earth and sky. The house felt alive, responsive to weather and season. It changed with the light. It aged with grace. Wright believed he had achieved something unprecedented, a distinctly American architecture that honored landscape, encouraged freedom, and rejected imitation. But progress rarely unfolds without resistance. In 1911 and 1912, the United States was straddling two worlds. Industrialization had created immense fortunes, but also social unrest. Traditional morality remained publicly dominant, yet intellectual movements were questioning its foundations. Taliesin stood at that crossroads. It embodied modernity, not only in form but in philosophy. It suggested that life could be reorganized, spaces opened, hierarchies softened, conventions challenged, and in that suggestion lay unease. Because Taliesin was not simply ahead of its time in design, it was ahead in its assumptions about how people might live. It assumed that individual fulfillment could outweigh communal judgment. It assumed that architecture could nurture new values. It assumed that vision justified risk. From a distance, the house seemed serene, resting confidently on its hill. Up close, it pulsed with innovation. Yet beneath the limestone and stucco, beneath the flowing rooms and panoramic windows, there remained an undercurrent of tension. A house built as sanctuary from scandal cannot fully escape the world it rejects. A manifesto carved into stone still stands within human society. Taliesin was a triumph of imagination. It was also a test of endurance, of acceptance, of fate. In building it, Wright believed he had aligned architecture with nature and life. But history would soon reveal that even the most harmonious designs exist within unpredictable human realities. The hill held the house gently. The valley stretched endlessly below. For a moment in time, it appeared that vision had prevailed over controversy, that modernity had found its home. But the very boldness that made Taliesin revolutionary also made it exposed. And as the seasons turned over the Wisconsin hills, the sanctuary Wright had so carefully shaped stood poised between brilliance and vulnerability, unaware of how swiftly the world could intrude. By the summer of 1914, Taliesin stood as both sanctuary and statement. its limestone walls warmed by the July sun, and its terraces opening toward the rolling Wisconsin hills with a quiet confidence that seemed to defy the criticism still murmuring beyond the valley. Frank Lloyd Wright was not there. Professional obligations had drawn him back to Chicago, leaving the estate in the care of a small household staff. Mama Borthwick Cheney remained at Taliesin with her 2 children, John and Martha, who had come to visit her for the season. Life at the house moved with a gentle rhythm, meals prepared in the kitchen wing, conversations drifting through open corridors, the late afternoon light stretching across drafting tables and garden paths. To any observer, it might have appeared peaceful, almost idyllic. Yet within the walls of this modern experiment, a storm was gathering that no architecture, no philosophy could contain. Among the servants employed at Taliesin was Julian Carleton, a Barbadian-born man who had been hired earlier that year as a handyman and cook. Carleton was quiet, reserved, and by most accounts competent in his duties. His wife, Gertrude, also worked briefly at the estate, but beneath the surface of ordinary domestic routine, something in Carleton had begun to fracture. The precise motives behind what would follow remained shrouded in uncertainty. Some contemporaries speculated about mental instability. Others suggested paranoia or grievances, real or imagined. What is known is chillingly clear. On August 15, 1914, as the household prepared for lunch, Carleton acted with devastating violence. He first attacked in the living quarters. Armed with a hatchet, he struck Mama and her children as they waited on the porch. The brutality was swift and merciless. Then, moving with calculated purpose, he set fire to the house, pouring gasoline through corridors and igniting the structure that Wright had so painstakingly designed. Flames surged through the wooden beams and across the low-pitched roofs. Smoke thickened in the air. Those inside the dining room, workmen and staff, found themselves trapped as the fire spread rapidly. Carleton waited outside with the hatchet, attacking those who attempted to escape the inferno. By the time the chaos subsided, 7 people were dead. Mama, her 2 children, a draftsman named Emil Brodell, gardener David Lindblom, foreman Thomas Brunker, and Ernest Weston, the son of another employee. Taliesin, conceived as a haven of progressive thought and artistic freedom, had become the site of one of the most horrifying domestic tragedies in American architectural history. Carleton attempted to take his own life by ingesting hydrochloric acid, which severely damaged his esophagus but did not kill him. Captured and jailed, he refused to explain his actions. He would later die of starvation in his cell weeks before he could stand trial. The motive behind the massacre died with him, leaving behind speculation but no definitive answer. Some accounts hinted at racial tensions and isolation in the rural community, others pointed toward possible mental illness, but history offers no clear narrative that can neatly contain such violence. The randomness, the incomprehensibility of it, lingers like smoke over the valley. When news reached Frank Lloyd Wright in Chicago, it struck with unimaginable force. The woman for whom he had risked reputation, marriage, and professional stability was gone, taken in a manner so brutal it defied comprehension. Taliesin itself, his architectural manifesto, his Declaration of Independence from convention, was charred and gutted. In a single afternoon, Wright lost both his partner and the physical embodiment of his ideals. Contemporary newspapers seized upon the tragedy with sensational headlines. For a public already divided in opinion about Wright's moral choices, the massacre seemed almost biblical in its drama. A house born of scandal consumed by fire and blood. Yet tragedy does not conform to narrative convenience. It does not validate gossip or moralize through architecture. It simply devastates. Wright returned to the ruins and walked among the blackened stone and twisted beams. The limestone walls still stood in places, stubborn against the flames, but the wooden interiors had been ravaged. Ash covered drafting instruments. The gardens were scorched. Silence replaced the hum of creative activity. For Wright, the loss was not abstract, it was intimate. Every room carried memory, every corridor echoed with absence. The hearth he had designed as the symbolic heart of domestic life was now cold and broken. Observers at the time expected Taliesin to remain a ruin, a cautionary monument to hubris or misfortune. But Wright's response defied expectation. Within months, he began rebuilding. He would call the reconstructed home Taliesin II. Some interpreted this as defiance, others as denial. But to Wright, architecture was never static. It evolved, endured, adapted. Rebuilding was not an erasure of grief, but an assertion that creation could persist even in the shadow of destruction. The reconstruction followed the original principles of organic architecture but incorporated refinements born of experience. Wright adjusted layouts, strengthened structural elements, and reconsidered materials. Yet no redesign could erase memory. The rebuilt Taliesin carried scars invisible to visitors but embedded in its foundation. It was no longer merely an architectural experiment. It was a memorial. The broader cultural context deepened the tragedy's resonance. In August 1914, Europe had just plunged into World War I. Headlines across the Atlantic told of mobilization and invasion. The world was entering an era of unprecedented violence. Against that backdrop, the massacre at Taliesin felt both intensely personal and eerily aligned with a global descent into conflict. Modernity, which had promised progress and enlightenment, now revealed its darker capacities. The optimism that had animated early 20th century thought seemed fragile. For Wright, the personal and professional intertwined in complex ways. Commissions had already slowed amid scandal. Now the association with tragedy cast a further shadow. Yet his creative drive did not diminish. If anything, it intensified. Taliesin became not just a residence but a crucible, a place where grief and design coexisted. He continued to draft new projects, to lecture, to refine his philosophy. Architecture for him was not escapism but survival. The rebuilt house once again opened to guests and collaborators, but its atmosphere had shifted. Where once Taliesin symbolized rebellion against Victorian excess, it now carried the weight of remembrance. Visitors walked through spaces that had been sites of unimaginable violence. The serene views of the valley felt tinged with solemnity. Nature remained indifferent, seasons turning with steady rhythm, grasses swaying in the wind as they had before and would long after. That indifference underscored the human vulnerability at the heart of the story. In examining the tragedy, historians resist simplistic explanations. There is no architectural flaw that invited catastrophe, no moral equation that balances innovation against fate. The massacre was an act of individual violence, its origins obscured by the perpetrator's silence, yet its impact reverberated through architectural history. Taliesin ceased to be merely a house too modern for its time. It became a testament to resilience amid horror. Wright's decision to rebuild also reasserted his philosophy. Organic architecture, he believed, was about growth and continuity. In nature, destruction and renewal coexist. Forest fires clear ground for new growth. Storms reshape landscapes. Taliesin's rebirth echoed that cycle. Still, the comparison offers limited comfort. Human grief does not regenerate as predictably as grass after flame. As years passed, the events of August 15th remained etched in collective memory. Taliesin would suffer another fire in 1925, further complicating its history. But the 1914 massacre stands as its defining rupture, a moment when visionary ambition collided with inexplicable violence. It challenges any romantic reading of the house as merely an artistic sanctuary. It reminds us that even the most forward-looking spaces exist within fragile human contexts. And yet, Taliesin endures. Its limestone walls continue to rest against the Wisconsin hillside. Visitors walk its terraces, study its proportions, and absorb its integration with landscape. They learn of Wright's genius, his innovations, his relentless belief in architecture as a living art. They also learn of the tragedy that once reduced it to ashes. The two narratives cannot be separated. They intertwine like beams and mortar. In the end, Taliesin's story is not solely about a house that was too modern. It is about the unpredictability of human existence within spaces designed for harmony. It is about the limits of control, the fragility of sanctuary, and the stubborn persistence of vision. Fire consumed wood and memory in 1914, but it did not extinguish the idea that architecture could aspire to something greater than ornament or imitation. The valley remains quiet. The hill still cradles the structure. Light moves across its windows as it did more than a century ago. But beneath that calm lies the echo of an afternoon when innovation met tragedy, and when a modern dream was tested by the darkest edge of human nature. In the months after the massacre of 1914, Taliesin stood in a strange state between ruin and resurrection. Its scorched beams cleared away, but its grief still hanging in the air like the scent of smoke that refuses to fully fade. Frank Lloyd Wright did not retreat from the site that had brought him such profound loss. Instead, he returned with a kind of defiant resolve, as though rebuilding the house might restore some measure of order to a world that had shattered without warning. The reconstruction of Taliesin, what would become known as Taliesin II, was not simply an architectural project. It was an act of mourning expressed through stone and timber. a refusal to let violence define the legacy of the place he had envisioned as the physical embodiment of his ideals. Work began swiftly. Wright altered certain aspects of the original design, tightening structural details and refining spatial relationships. Yet he preserved the fundamental philosophy that had guided the first iteration. The limestone still came from the surrounding hills. The low horizontal line still mirrored the contours of the valley. Windows continued to stretch outward, dissolving the barrier between interior and landscape. If Taliesin I had been an experiment in living organically with nature, Taliesin II became something more layered, a testament to endurance. It acknowledged destruction without surrendering to it. For Wright, rebuilding was a declaration that creativity could rise from devastation, that architecture, like the natural world it sought to emulate, could regenerate after fire. But beneath that determination lay a private sorrow that no redesign could erase. Mama Borthwick Cheney's absence reshaped the emotional landscape of the house. The intellectual companionship and progressive energy she had brought to Taliesin were gone, leaving Wright to navigate both personal grief and public scrutiny. Newspapers had not forgotten the scandal that preceded the tragedy, and the sensational reporting surrounding the massacre ensured that Taliesin remained linked to controversy in the public imagination. Wright, once already viewed by some as defiant of social norms, now carried the additional burden of being associated with one of the most horrifying domestic crimes of the era. The narrative of modernity and rebellion that had defined Taliesin's early years was now intertwined with a darker legacy. Yet Wright refused to allow his professional life to collapse under that weight. He continued to lecture and to accept commissions, though opportunities fluctuated. The architectural community regarded him with a mixture of admiration and unease. His Prairie School innovations had already shifted American design, but Taliesin's tragedy cast a long shadow. Still, within the rebuilt walls, Wright sought continuity. The studio resumed its function as a creative workshop. Drafting tables once again filled with plans and elevations. Students and collaborators moved through the corridors, participating in a shared pursuit of architectural evolution. Taliesin remained not merely a residence, but a working laboratory. In 1915, as Europe descended deeper into the First World War, Wright traveled to Japan to oversee the construction of the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, a commission that would occupy him for years. The journey offered both professional redemption and personal distance. Japan's architectural traditions, emphasizing horizontality, integration with nature, and refined craftsmanship, resonated with his own philosophy. While Taliesin stood in Wisconsin as a reconstructed sanctuary, Wright's ideas were finding new expression abroad. Yet even across the Pacific, Taliesin remained the emotional anchor of his life, the place where his architectural convictions had first crystallized into lived experience. The years that followed were marked by both persistence and instability. In 1925, disaster struck again. An electrical fault in the telephone system ignited a second fire, consuming significant portions of Taliesin II. Flames once more swept through the wooden interiors, leaving limestone walls standing amid ruin. For many, the recurrence seemed almost mythic, as though the house were cursed or fated to perpetual trial. But Wright responded as he had before, with reconstruction. Taliesin III emerged from the ashes, incorporating further refinements and modernizations. Each iteration layered history upon design, embedding resilience into the very fabric of the structure. These cycles of destruction and renewal deepened Taliesin's symbolic weight. It was no longer simply a bold architectural statement challenging Gilded Age conventions. It became a narrative of survival, reflecting the volatility of the 20th century itself. Industrialization, war, economic upheaval, modernity brought both innovation and instability. Taliesin mirrored that duality. It stood as a vision of harmony with nature, yet it endured forces that seemed to contradict harmony entirely. During the 1930s, amid the Great Depression, Wright formalized Taliesin's role as an educational center by establishing the Taliesin Fellowship. Apprentices lived and worked at the estate, immersing themselves in architecture as a total way of life. They farmed the land, studied drafting, and participated in communal routines that blurred the boundaries between labor and art. The fellowship transformed Taliesin from a private residence into a living school. This evolution reflected Wright's belief that architecture was not merely about constructing buildings, but about shaping human experience. Taliesin became a microcosm of his philosophy, a place where design, community, and environment intersected. Yet the tragedy of 1914 was never erased from memory. Visitors walking the terraces or standing before the hearth often carried knowledge of the violence that had once unfolded there. Guides recounted the story with solemnity, The house, in its serenity, bore silent witness to its own past. Wright himself rarely spoke publicly about the massacre in detail, but its impact lingered in his guarded demeanor and relentless drive. If Taliesin had once symbolized personal rebellion, it now symbolized endurance against forces beyond control. As Wright's career progressed, he would design some of his most celebrated works: Falling Water, the Guggenheim Museum, and countless residential projects that expanded the language of modern architecture. Yet Taliesin remained the spiritual core of his practice. It was where ideas were tested, refined, and debated. It was where apprentices learned not only drafting techniques, but a philosophy of organic integration. And it was where the complexities of Wright's own life, his ambitions, relationships, triumphs, and failures, intersected most intimately. The broader cultural lens through which Taliesin was viewed also evolved. By mid-century, modern architecture had gained acceptance, and Wright's once radical principles influenced mainstream design. The house that had seemed too unconventional for its time became recognized as foundational. Critics who once dismissed it as eccentric began to see its prophetic qualities. Taliesin's horizontality anticipated the modernist embrace of simplicity. Its integration with landscape foreshadowed environmental consciousness. The very features that had unsettled early observers became hallmarks of innovation. Still, Taliesin's story resists romantic simplification. It is tempting to frame the narrative as one of genius tested by fate and ultimately vindicated by history, but the reality is more complex. The house embodies contradiction, harmony and violence, innovation and vulnerability, sanctuary and exposure. It challenges the notion that architecture alone can shield against human unpredictability. Wright sought to create spaces that nurtured balance, yet balance cannot eliminate chaos. By the time of Wright's death in 1959, Taliesin had endured nearly half a century of transformation. It had burned and risen, hosted intellectual gatherings and quiet domestic evenings, educated generations of architects, and stood through economic depression and global war. The hill upon which it rests remained constant, anchoring the structure in the same Wisconsin soil from which its limestone was drawn. Nature continued its cycles, indifferent yet encompassing. Today, Taliesin stands as a preserved historic site, visited by those who study architectural history and those drawn by the drama of its past. Walking its corridors, one senses layers of time embedded in the walls. The rebuilt beams, the altered layouts, the subtle shifts in material, all speak to a house that refused finality. It was never frozen in a single moment. It evolved, adapted, and persisted. Section 5 of Taliesin's story is not defined solely by loss, nor solely by resilience. It is defined by the uneasy coexistence of both. Wright's decision to rebuild, twice, transformed the narrative from tragedy alone into something more enduring. Taliesin became a testament to the belief that creation can follow destruction, that vision can survive even when deeply wounded. Yet the scars remain part of its identity, inseparable from its beauty. In the quiet of the Wisconsin Valley, as evening light settles across limestone walls and the horizon stretches beyond the terraces, Taliesin appears tranquil, but its tranquility is hard-earned. Beneath the calm lies a century of upheaval and renewal. The Gilded Age mansion that was too modern did not fade into obscurity after its darkest day. Instead, it absorbed its own history and continued forward, carrying with it the memory of fire, the echo of grief, and the unyielding persistence of architectural vision. By the 1930s, Taliesin had evolved beyond the private refuge Frank Lloyd Wright once built for himself and Mama Borthwick Cheney. It had become something far more ambitious and, in many ways, more radical than the house that first rose from the Wisconsin hillside in 1911. The fires, the scandal, the massacre, all of it had reshaped the estate's identity. What stood now was not merely Taliesin III reconstructed and refined, but the beating heart of an experiment Wright called the Taliesin Fellowship. In the midst of the Great Depression, when architectural commissions were scarce and the nation wrestled with economic despair, Wright did something unexpected. He opened his home not as a sanctuary of retreat, but as a communal workshop for a new generation of architects who would live, work, and learn under his direct guidance. Taliesin became less a mansion and more a living organism, sustained by collective effort and bound by a philosophy that blurred the line between education and daily life. The fellowship, founded in 1932, attracted young apprentices from across the United States and abroad. They came not simply to study drafting techniques, but to immerse themselves in Wright's doctrine of organic architecture. Unlike traditional architectural schools, which emphasized academic structure and theoretical study, Taliesin demanded participation in the rhythms of land and labor. Apprentices farmed the fields, tended livestock, cooked meals, and repaired buildings. They studied geometry in the morning and harvested crops in the afternoon. Wright believed architecture was inseparable from the environment in which it existed, and therefore architects must understand that environment intimately. The valley surrounding Taliesin was not scenery, it was curriculum. Life at Taliesin during these years carried an almost monastic quality, though it was anything but austere. Wright and his third wife, Frank Lloyd Wright, cultivated an atmosphere that combined discipline with artistic intensity. Music filled the drafting studio in the evenings. Discussions on philosophy and aesthetics unfolded over communal dinners. Olgivanna, influenced by the teachings of mystic George Gurdjieff, introduced structured movement exercises and spiritual practices into the fellowship's routine. For some apprentices, this fusion of architecture, agriculture, art, and spiritual exploration felt transformative. For others, it felt demanding, even insular. But all recognized that Taliesin was unlike any other place of study in America. The house itself adapted to accommodate this new role. Sleeping quarters expanded, workspaces multiplied. Temporary structures rose and fell as needs shifted. The estate became a constantly evolving campus shaped by the hands of those who inhabited it. Apprentices constructed outbuildings and modified interiors under Wright's supervision, learning through direct engagement with materials. Limestone blocks were cut and set into walls. Wooden beams were measured, sanded, and raised. Through these acts of making, students absorbed Wright's belief that architecture was not a detached profession but a lived experience. Yet Taliesin's transformation into a communal environment also intensified its complexities. Wright was a charismatic leader, but he was also demanding and often uncompromising. Apprentices paid tuition not only in money, but in labor and loyalty. They lived under his authority, absorbing both his brilliance and his volatility. Some flourished under the intensity, others departed disillusioned. The fellowship required surrender to a singular vision, Wright's vision. Taliesin, once a symbol of personal rebellion against social norms, had become a microcosm of Wright's authority, shaped by his preferences, his temper, and his philosophy. During the winter months, the fellowship migrated to the Arizona desert, where Wright established Taliesin West near Scottsdale in 1937. This seasonal movement reinforced the idea that architecture should respond to climate and geography. The apprentices split their year between the lush hills of Wisconsin and the stark expanses of the Sonoran Desert, experiencing firsthand how materials, light, and space shift across environments. Taliesin in Wisconsin remained the spiritual origin, the ancestral home, while Taliesin West became its sunlit counterpart. Together they embodied Wright's conviction that buildings must belong to their landscapes. As the fellowship matured, Taliesin's identity as a Gilded Age anomaly faded further into history. The opulent mansions of America's industrial elite had largely become relics of a bygone era, many struggling under the financial burdens of maintenance during the Depression. Taliesin, by contrast, thrived not on inherited wealth but on continuous reinvention. Its value lay not in gold leaf or imported marble, but in ideas. It did not serve as a monument to excess, it functioned as a workshop of innovation. In this sense, Taliesin had outgrown the social framework that once judged it scandalous. It now stood as a beacon for modern architecture's next chapter. Yet the memory of 1914 lingered quietly beneath the daily routines of drafting and farming. Apprentices were aware of the tragedy that had unfolded on the grounds decades earlier. The story was part of Taliesin's mythology, a reminder that even visionary spaces could not escape human darkness. That awareness lent the estate a layered atmosphere, creative energy tempered by historical gravity. The hearth burned again, laughter echoed through corridors, but the land remembered. The hillside that cradled Taliesin had witnessed both aspiration and horror. Wright himself seemed energized by the fellowship years. His later career experienced a resurgence, culminating in some of his most celebrated works. Falling Water, completed in 1939, embodied his principles of integration with nature more dramatically than ever before. The Guggenheim Museum in New York, designed in the 1940s and completed after his death, challenged conventional museum architecture with its spiraling ramp and sculptural form. These achievements were not separate from Taliesin, they were extensions of the ideas cultivated there. The apprentices who lived and worked at Taliesin contributed to drawings, models, and conceptual discussions that shaped these projects. The estate functioned as an incubator for modern architecture's evolution. As the decades progressed, Taliesin continued to shift. Electricity, plumbing, and structural systems were updated. Interiors were rearranged to suit changing needs. Unlike many historic homes preserved in static form, Taliesin resisted fossilization. Wright altered it repeatedly, treating it as a canvas rather than a museum. Visitors sometimes struggled to distinguish original elements from later modifications, but that ambiguity was part of its essence. Taliesin was never meant to be frozen in time. It was architecture as process. The broader cultural context of mid-century America also reshaped Taliesin's meaning. The Second World War brought technological transformation and global upheaval. Post-war suburban expansion introduced millions of Americans to modernist principles in simplified forms. Open floor plans, large windows, and integration with landscape ideas once considered radical became increasingly mainstream. Wright's influence permeated residential design across the country. In that changing landscape, Taliesin no longer appeared too modern. It appeared prophetic. Yet prophetic vision does not erase contradiction. Wright's personal life remained complex and, at times, turbulent. His relationships, financial struggles, and uncompromising personality continued to generate both admiration and criticism. Taliesin reflected those tensions. It was a place of collaboration, but also hierarchy. It fostered creativity, but demanded conformity to Wright's ideals. The fellowship offered community, but revolved around a single, dominant figure. Taliesin's modernity lay not only in its architectural form, but in its experimental social structure, a structure that worked for some and strained others. When Wright died in 1959 at the age of 91, Taliesin faced an uncertain future. Could a place so deeply tied to one individual's vision survive without him? The fellowship continued, preserving the estate and maintaining its educational mission. Over time, Taliesin transitioned from a working laboratory to a historic site, recognized for its architectural significance. Restoration efforts sought to stabilize aging structures while respecting the layers of modification that defined its character. Today, walking through Taliesin reveals a paradox. The house feels intimate yet expansive, rooted yet evolving. Its limestone walls still echo the hills from which they were quarried. Its windows still frame the valley in horizontal bands of light. But beneath the serenity lies a century of transformation, scandal, tragedy, rebirth, education, and innovation woven into its fabric. Taliesin's story cannot be reduced to a single theme. It is not merely the tale of a mansion too modern for its time. It is the chronicle of an idea tested repeatedly by circumstance. Section 6 of this narrative reveals Taliesin not as a static monument, but as a living institution shaped by community and resilience. The fellowship years transformed a private experiment into a shared enterprise. The estate became both home and school, sanctuary and stage, memory and aspiration. Its tragedy did not define it. Its response to tragedy did. Its modernity did not isolate it. It eventually influenced an entire architectural movement. As dusk settles over the Wisconsin hills and shadows stretch across the terraces, Taliesin stands quietly, neither boastful nor diminished. It has endured fire, grief, reinvention, and acclaim. It has outlived its creator yet continues to carry his imprint. And in that endurance lies its greatest testament, not to perfection, but to persistence. By the time the 20th century reached its midpoint, Taliesin no longer stood as an architectural outlier perched defiantly on a Wisconsin hillside. It had become a pilgrimage site for those who believed that architecture could shape civilization itself. The young apprentices who once arrived uncertain and wide-eyed had matured into architects carrying Frank Lloyd Wright's philosophy into cities and suburbs across America. Yet within the limestone walls and low, sheltering roofs of Taliesin, the atmosphere remained intimate, almost insular, as though the world beyond the valley were a distant echo. It was here, in the interplay between isolation and influence, that Taliesin's identity deepened further, not as a relic of the Gilded Age, nor merely as the site of tragedy, but as a living manifesto whose relevance expanded with each passing decade. The post-war era reshaped the American landscape with astonishing speed. Subdivisions spread across former farmland, highways stitched together once remote communities, glass and steel towers rose in city centers, symbols of corporate power and technological progress. Modern architecture, once controversial, became the visual language of a new age. And yet, amid the surge of international-style skyscrapers and mass-produced housing, Taliesin retained something different, an insistence on individuality, on site-specific design, on architecture as art rather than commodity. Visitors who traveled the winding roads to Spring Green did not encounter a blueprint for uniformity. They encountered a philosophy rooted in place. Frank Lloyd Wright, even into his 80s, remained a commanding presence at Taliesin. He moved through drafting rooms with deliberate energy, correcting apprentices' drawings, revising proportions, urging them to think not in isolated lines but in relationships between space and landscape. He rejected imitation of European modernists as firmly as he had once rejected Victorian ornamentation. For Wright, true modernity was not about abandoning decoration for minimalism. It was about harmonizing structure, environment, and human need. Taliesin served as proof that this harmony could be sustained across decades. Yet the estate's growing fame introduced new complexities. Journalists arrived seeking stories about the architect who had rebuilt his life from scandal and fire. Architecture students toured the grounds, sketchbooks in hand, eager to absorb lessons from the master. Wealthy patrons visited in hopes of commissioning homes that carried the Taliesin signature. The quiet valley increasingly felt the presence of the outside world. What had once been a refuge from public judgment now functioned as a cultural landmark. The house that was once whispered about in scandal columns was now featured in architectural journals as a pioneering achievement. This shift in perception carried irony. When Taliesin was first constructed in 1911, critics viewed it as too unconventional, too radical in its rejection of established forms. By the 1950s, its horizontality and open interiors had influenced countless residential designs. The very features that once unsettled observers became hallmarks of progressive living. Large windows, integrated furniture, flowing spaces, these elements entered mainstream American homes. Taliesin's modernity had not faded, it had permeated the culture. The mansion that seemed too modern had quietly reshaped what modern meant. Still, beneath the accolades lay tension. Wright's relationship with the architectural establishment remained strained. Institutions that once dismissed him now celebrated him. Yet he remained skeptical of trends that diluted his principles. Taliesin apprentices witnessed this duality firsthand. Pride in recognition tempered by frustration at misinterpretation. Wright insisted that organic architecture was not a style to replicate, but a way of thinking. He warned against reducing it to aesthetic formula. In his view, many post-war designs adopted surface features without embracing the deeper integration with site and purpose that defined his work. As Wright's health gradually declined, the future of Taliesin became an unspoken concern. The estate was inseparable from his personality. Its expansions, alterations, and rhythms bore his imprint. Apprentices who had grown under his mentorship now faced the prospect of carrying forward a legacy without the force of his direct guidance. Taliesin had survived tragedy and fire, but could it survive succession? The question lingered quietly through the corridors. When Wright died in April 1959, the architectural world marked the end of an era. Tributes celebrated his innovations and enduring influence. At Taliesin, the loss felt deeply personal. The hearth that had symbolized domestic unity flickered in silence. Drafting tables stood momentarily still, yet the fellowship continued, sustained by those who believed that the estate's mission transcended any single lifetime. Taliesin became not merely the house Wright built, but the institution he inspired. In the decades that followed, preservation emerged as a central challenge. Buildings designed to evolve are not easily frozen in time. Taliesin's layered history, 3 major reconstructions, countless modifications, complicated restoration efforts. Conservators grappled with questions of authenticity. Which iteration should be preserved? The original 1911 design lost to fire? The 1914 reconstruction? The later alterations Wright made in the 1920s and 1930s? Ultimately, Taliesin resisted simplification. Its authenticity lay in its evolution. Preserving it meant honoring change as much as origin. Recognition of Taliesin's significance expanded internationally. Scholars studied its relationship to the Prairie School movement. Architects traced its influence through mid-century design. Visitors walked its terraces not only to admire craftsmanship, but to understand philosophy made tangible. In 2019, Taliesin, along with several other Wright works, was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site as part of the 20th century architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright. The honor affirmed what had become evident over decades. The hillside experiment in Wisconsin had entered the global narrative of architectural history. Yet for all its acclaim, Taliesin retains an undercurrent of humility. It does not tower over the valley, it nestles within it. It does not glitter with extravagance, it absorbs the colors of earth and sky. Its power lies in proportion and placement, in the subtle dialogue between stone and horizon. Walking through its corridors today, one senses continuity rather than spectacle. Light still filters through windows in horizontal bands. Wind still moves across the terraces. The landscape remains an active participant in the experience. The tragedy of 1914 remains woven into guided tours and historical accounts, a solemn chapter that cannot be omitted. but it no longer defines Taliesin's identity. Instead, it underscores resilience. The estate's story is not a simple arc from scandal to triumph. It is a series of tests, moral, structural, generational, met with adaptation. Taliesin endured because it was never static. It shifted with circumstance, rebuilt when necessary, reinterpreted when challenged. In examining Section 7 of this narrative, we see Taliesin at the intersection of memory and momentum. It is a house that carries the imprint of grief, yet radiates creative energy. It is a school that emerged from private ambition, yet shaped public architecture. It is a monument that refuses monumentalism. The Gilded Age mansion that was too modern did not become obsolete. It became foundational. As twilight descends over the Wisconsin hills, Taliesin's low roofs cast long shadows across the grass. The valley grows quiet, much as it did more than a century ago when Wright first imagined a house of the hill rather than on the hill. The limestone walls hold warmth from the day's sun, releasing it slowly into the evening air. Within those walls resides a story layered with contradiction, innovation born of rebellion, renewal born of tragedy, legacy sustained through change. Taliesin endures not because it escaped history, but because it absorbed it, shaping and reshaping itself in response. And in that enduring presence, it continues to whisper the same radical idea that defined its beginning. That architecture, when rooted in place and conviction, can outlast even the fiercest flames of its own time. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, Taliesin entered a new chapter, one defined not by creation or catastrophe, but by stewardship. The limestone walls that had survived fire and reinvention now faced a quieter, more complex challenge. Time itself. Wood ages, roof lines sag, foundations shift subtly with seasons of freeze and thaw. Unlike the dramatic infernos of 1914 and 1925, this threat arrived slowly, almost imperceptibly. And yet, for a house conceived as a living organism, the question of preservation posed a paradox. How do you protect a structure designed to evolve without freezing it into something it was never meant to be? By the late 20th century, Taliesin had become both educational institution and historic landmark. The Taliesin Fellowship continued its apprenticeship model, though changing cultural and economic conditions required adaptation. Architecture as a profession had transformed. Digital drafting replaced hand-rendered plans, and global influences blurred regional distinctions. Yet at Taliesin, the core philosophy endured. Students still engaged with the land. They still walked the terraces at dusk, observing how light traced the valley's contours. They still absorbed the lesson that buildings must belong to their environment. The estate functioned as a bridge between eras, carrying forward principles rooted in the early 1900s into a world shaped by technology and globalization. Preservation efforts intensified as recognition of Taliesin's significance expanded. Architectural historians emphasized that the estate was not a single structure, but a complex of interconnected buildings, each reflecting a different phase of Wright's life. Stabilizing the limestone required careful attention to moisture and erosion. Restoring wooden beams meant sourcing materials that matched original craftsmanship. Conservationists faced delicate decisions: replace deteriorated elements to ensure safety, or retain aging materials to preserve authenticity. Every repair risked altering the character Wright had so carefully composed. Public access introduced additional layers of responsibility. Visitors traveled from across the globe, drawn by the mythology of genius and tragedy that surrounded Taliesin. Guided tours unfolded through living rooms, studios, and terraces where apprentices once debated geometry and proportion. The estate became a classroom not only for architects but for tourists seeking connection to a defining chapter of American design. Managing foot traffic while maintaining structural integrity required balance. Taliesin had been built as a home and workshop, not as a museum. Now it needed to function as both. In 2019, when Taliesin was inscribed as part of the UNESCO World Heritage listing recognizing the 20th century architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, the designation formalized what decades of scholarship had affirmed. The hillside experiment in Wisconsin stood alongside global architectural landmarks. The honor carried prestige, but also obligation. International recognition heightened expectations for preservation, interpretation, and sustainability. Taliesin was no longer solely an American treasure. It was a shared cultural heritage site. Yet beyond formal accolades, Taliesin continued to resonate for more intimate reasons. In an age increasingly defined by urban density and digital abstraction, its integration with landscape felt quietly radical. Contemporary architecture often prioritized spectacle iconic silhouettes, dramatic facades designed for skyline photography. Taliesin, by contrast, asked visitors to look outward rather than upward. Its horizontality directed attention toward horizon lines and seasonal shifts. It reminded observers that architecture could be measured not only by height or scale, but by harmony. The environmental movement of the late 20th century cast Wright's organic principles in new light. Concepts of sustainability, passive solar design, and site-sensitive construction echoed ideas he had championed decades earlier. Taliesin's orientation along the hill, its deep overhangs shading windows, its use of local materials, these choices aligned with ecological consciousness long before it became a global priority. Scholars re-examined Wright not merely as a stylistic innovator, but as an early advocate for architecture that respected natural systems. Taliesin's survival thus carried renewed relevance in conversations about climate and resource stewardship. Still, preservation demanded financial stability, and that stability was not guaranteed. Maintaining a sprawling historic estate required substantial funding. Non-profit organizations overseeing Taliesin navigated complex partnerships, grants, and fundraising campaigns. Debates occasionally arose over governance, educational direction, and long-term strategy. The estate's history of evolution meant that change was inevitable, yet each shift sparked discussion about fidelity to Wright's vision. How much transformation could Taliesin undergo without losing its essence? The question echoed the broader tension between honoring the past and accommodating the future. Walking through Taliesin today reveals traces of every era layered subtly upon one another. The original 1911 conception whispers through spatial relationships and material choices. The reconstruction after the 1914 tragedy lingers in structural adjustments. The 1925 fire's aftermath can be felt in refinements and reinforcements. The fellowship years remain visible in dormitories and communal spaces, shaped by apprentice labor. Each generation left fingerprints, yet none erased what came before. Taliesin embodies continuity through adaptation. Visitors often pause at the crest of the hill, gazing across the valley that first inspired Wright to build here. The view remains remarkably unchanged. Fields stretch outward, interrupted by clusters of trees and the winding river below. The horizon glows at sunset, much as it did when Wright declared that no house should sit on a hill, but of a hill. In that enduring landscape lies part of Taliesin's power. While architectural trends rise and fall, the valley persists, anchoring the estate in a larger rhythm of nature. The tragedy of 1914, though over a century distant, continues to shape interpretation. It is recounted not as sensational spectacle, but as solemn context. The massacre underscored the fragility of sanctuary and the unpredictability of human violence. Yet Taliesin's subsequent survival reframes that darkness. Rather than being defined by destruction, the estate demonstrates that places can absorb trauma and continue forward. The rebuilt walls stand as quiet rebuttals to finality. For modern audiences, Taliesin offers more than historical insight, it offers perspective. In a world accelerating toward constant innovation, it suggests the value of rootedness. In an era preoccupied with instant results, it embodies patience, its construction, reconstruction, and preservation unfolding across generations. In a culture often divided between nostalgia and futurism, Taliesin integrates both. It honors memory while remaining open to change. Section 8 of this narrative thus reveals Taliesin as an ongoing dialogue rather than a closed chapter. The Gilded Age mansion that was once deemed too modern has outlived the era that questioned it. It has influenced architectural language across continents. It has weathered physical fire and the slower burn of time, and yet it remains grounded, literally and philosophically, in the Wisconsin hillside from which it first rose. As evening settles over the estate, lights glow softly within the low windows, mirroring the warmth of earlier decades. The limestone absorbs the last hues of twilight. Wind brushes the grasses that ripple toward the horizon. Taliesin stands not as a relic suspended in amber, but as a living testament to vision sustained through adaptation. Its story continues, written not only in archives and guidebooks, but in the ongoing care of those who believe that architecture can shape how we dwell upon the earth. The hill still cradles the house. The valley still opens wide beneath it. And in that enduring relationship between stone and soil, past and present, Taliesin remains quietly, resolutely modern. No longer too modern for its time, but timeless in its integration of place, memory, and aspiration. As the decades unfold and the immediacy of fire and scandal recede into the distance of recorded history, Taliesin enters a quieter, more contemplative phase of its existence. one in which its greatest challenge is not survival from catastrophe, but interpretation. What does Taliesin mean now, in an era far removed from the moral codes of the Gilded Age and the early tremors of modernism? How should a house born of personal rebellion, scarred by violence and sustained by generations of apprentices, be understood in a world saturated with images and instant narratives? The answer lies not in reducing Taliesin to a symbol, but in recognizing it as a layered human document, architecture as autobiography, landscape as witness, design as declaration. In contemporary architectural discourse, Frank Lloyd Wright's name carries near-mythic weight. His work is studied in universities, referenced in design studios, and debated in scholarly journals. Yet Taliesin remains distinct among his creations, because it was never simply a commission. It was not constrained by a client's expectations or urban regulations. It was a personal manifesto made inhabitable. That distinction gives Taliesin a vulnerability absent from many of Wright's other masterpieces. Falling Water dramatizes integration with nature. The Guggenheim Museum redefines urban space. But Taliesin reveals Wright himself, his ambitions, contradictions, and relentless need to shape his environment according to his convictions. This personal dimension complicates preservation. When conservators restore a beam or repair a roofline at Taliesin, they are not merely maintaining a historic structure, they are safeguarding an intimate narrative. Every corridor carries echoes of conversations between Wright and his apprentices. Every terrace recalls evenings when music drifted across the valley. The hearth, central to Wright's philosophy of domestic unity, stands as both architectural feature and emotional anchor. To walk through Taliesin is to encounter layers of intention embedded in material form, yet interpretation extends beyond physical preservation. It requires confronting the full complexity of Taliesin's story. The 1914 massacre cannot be separated from the estate's identity, nor can the scandal surrounding Wright's relationship with Mama Borthwick Cheney be softened into romantic myth. Taliesin was born of defiance against social convention, and that defiance carried consequences. Modern audiences, more accustomed to public figures living unconventional lives, may view the scandal with less shock than early 20th century observers. But understanding the cultural climate of 1911, its rigid moral expectations and public scrutiny, remains essential to grasping why Taliesin was once considered transgressive. In recent years, scholars have also examined the social structure of the Taliesin Fellowship with renewed attention. The apprenticeship model, while innovative, operated within a hierarchy centered on Wright's authority. Apprentices paid tuition and contributed labor, living within a system shaped by his vision and his temperament. For some, the experience was transformative. For others, it was demanding and insular. Contemporary reflection invites nuanced assessment rather than unquestioned reverence. Taliesin becomes not only a site of inspiration, but a case study in leadership, mentorship, and the balance between individual genius and collective contribution. Environmental consciousness has further reframed Taliesin's relevance. In an age defined by climate anxiety and resource scarcity, Wright's insistence that buildings belong to their landscapes resonates with urgency. Taliesin's orientation along the hillside, its use of local limestone, its deep overhangs moderating sunlight, these design choices reflect principles now central to sustainable architecture. What once appeared stylistically radical now appears environmentally prescient. The house demonstrates that harmony with nature is not an aesthetic trend, but a structural philosophy. Still, Taliesin resists simplification into a sustainability prototype. It remains rooted in its specific geography, inseparable from the Wisconsin valley that shaped its form. The river below, the fields stretching toward the horizon, the shifting seasons, all contribute to the experience of the house. Snow gathers along low roof lines in winter, emphasizing horizontality. Spring brings new green against pale stone. Summer light floods through windows in golden bands. Autumn paints the surrounding hills in muted tones that echo the limestone's warmth. Taliesin is not static architecture. It is architecture in conversation with time. Public engagement continues to evolve. Digital archives allow global audiences to explore Wright's drawings and correspondence. Virtual tours supplement physical visits. Yet the essence of Taliesin remains experiential. Photographs cannot fully capture the sensation of moving through its compressed entryways into expansive living spaces, or the way terraces extend outward like invitations to the landscape. The house communicates through proportion and sequence, guiding the body as much as the eye. In this embodied experience lies its enduring power. Financial and organizational challenges persist, as they do for many historic sites. Maintaining structural integrity while honoring Wright's evolving design philosophy requires careful strategy. Partnerships between preservation foundations, educational institutions, and cultural organizations aim to ensure Taliesin's future. Fundraising campaigns highlight its architectural significance, while community events connect it to local audiences. The estate's survival depends not only on admiration, but on sustained commitment. Section 9 of Taliesin's story thus reveals a house navigating modernity anew. It is no longer too modern for its time. Instead, it must prove its relevance to a time that moves rapidly and often superficially. Its lessons are subtle, requiring patience to absorb. It teaches that architecture can emerge from landscape rather than impose upon it. It suggests that personal conviction, though controversial, can shape enduring cultural contributions. It reminds us that resilience is not absence of trauma, but adaptation in its aftermath. As twilight descends once more over the Wisconsin hills, Taliesin stands in contemplative stillness. The valley below remains expansive and quiet, much as it did when Wright first surveyed the land and envisioned a house of the hill. The limestone walls, touched by more than a century of weather, hold warmth gathered throughout the day. Within those walls lies a chronicle of ambition, loss, renewal, and influence. Taliesin endures not because it escaped history's turbulence, but because it absorbed it layer by layer until contradiction itself became part of its strength. The Gilded Age mansion that once unsettled its contemporaries has matured into a touchstone of architectural thought. Its story continues to unfold through scholarship, preservation, and visitation. And in its continued presence, quiet, grounded, unpretentious, Taliesin offers a final enduring lesson that modernity is not measured by novelty alone, but by the capacity to remain meaningful as the world changes around it. In the end, Taliesin is not defined by the year it was built, nor by the flames that twice threatened to erase it, nor even by the fame of the man who conceived it. It is defined by endurance, an endurance that feels almost improbable when one retraces the path from scandal to massacre, from ashes to reconstruction, from private refuge to global landmark. The Gilded Age mansion that was once considered too modern did not simply survive its time. It outlived the assumptions that sought to confine it, and in doing so, it transformed from controversy into continuity. When Frank Lloyd Wright first stood upon the Wisconsin hillside and imagined a house that would grow from the land rather than sit upon it, he was not merely designing a residence, he was articulating a worldview. He believed that architecture could align human life with natural rhythms, that walls could frame not just rooms but relationships, that space could influence spirit. Taliesin embodied that belief with uncompromising clarity. It rejected imitation of European aristocracy at a moment when American wealth often expressed itself through borrowed grandeur. It embraced horizontality, integration, and intimacy at a time when vertical excess and ornament dominated elite taste. It was, in every sense, ahead of its era. But being ahead of one's era carries risk. Taliesin's modernity unsettled neighbors. Its origin story ignited public outrage, and in 1914, its promise was shattered by violence so sudden and brutal that it seemed to defy explanation. The massacre that claimed the lives of Mama Borthwick Cheney, her children, and others within the household cast a shadow that no architectural innovation could dispel. For a moment, it appeared that Taliesin would be remembered only as the site of tragedy, a cautionary tale bound to scandal and fire. Yet the true measure of Taliesin's legacy lies in what followed. Wright rebuilt, not once, but twice. In doing so, he transformed destruction into a kind of dialogue with fate. Each reconstruction layered resilience upon the original vision. The limestone walls rose again. The terraces extended once more toward the valley. The hearth regained its warmth. Taliesin refused to remain a ruin. It insisted on renewal. As decades unfolded, the house evolved into a school, a community, a workshop of ideas. The Taliesin Fellowship carried Wright's philosophy into new generations, embedding organic architecture into the broader language of American design. Apprentices farmed the land and drafted plans under the same roofs that had once sheltered scandal and sorrow. Taliesin became less a solitary statement and more a shared endeavor. Its story expanded beyond one man's ambition into a collective pursuit of architectural harmony. And then time itself began to reshape its meaning. The architectural establishment that once viewed Wright as an iconoclast came to recognize him as foundational. Features once deemed radical, open plans, integrated furniture, expansive windows, entered mainstream practice. Environmental consciousness reframed his principles as visionary rather than eccentric. The mansion that was too modern gradually became timeless. Yet Taliesin resists romantic simplification. It does not allow its tragedy to be forgotten, nor its controversies to be erased. Its corridors carry memory as surely as they carry light. Visitors who walk its paths encounter not a flawless monument, but a human narrative etched in stone. The house reminds us that genius and vulnerability often coexist, that innovation can provoke resistance, and that creation cannot shield against unpredictability. In its quiet way, Taliesin also challenges contemporary assumptions about permanence. Many grand estates of the Gilded Age were built as monuments to wealth, intended to assert dominance over landscape and society alike. Some have vanished, sold, or demolished as fortunes shifted. Taliesin, by contrast, was never about spectacle. Its strength lay in proportion and placement. In its dialogue with the hill and valley, it endured not because it was ostentatious, but because it belonged. Its limestone came from nearby quarries. Its lines echoed the horizon. It felt inevitable, as though the land itself had shaped it. That sense of belonging may be its most enduring lesson. In a century defined by rapid urbanization, technological acceleration, and environmental strain, Taliesin stands as a reminder that progress need not sever connection to place. Wright's insistence that no house should sit on a hill but of a hill remains a quiet rebuke to architecture that ignores context. Taliesin's horizontality still guides the eye outward, towards fields and river, towards sky and shifting light. It invites contemplation rather than conquest. As preservation efforts continue into the 21st century, Taliesin's survival depends on stewardship as much as admiration. Conservationists repair beams and stabilize foundations. Educators interpret its history for new audiences. Scholars debate its social complexities and architectural innovations. Each generation re-examines the estate through its own lens, finding relevance in different aspects of its story. Yet beneath those evolving interpretations lies a constant, the physical presence of the house on the hillside, unchanged in its essential relationship to the land. Section 10 of this narrative brings us not to an ending, but to an understanding. Taliesin's tragedy does not eclipse its triumphs. Its controversies do not diminish its contributions. Instead, they enrich its narrative, rendering it profoundly human. It is a place where ambition met resistance, where love met loss, where destruction met determination. It is a house that absorbed contradiction and continued forward. As evening settles over Spring Green and the last light slips across the valley, Taliesin stands in quiet silhouette. The limestone glows softly, echoing the hues of the earth from which it was drawn. The terraces rest against the slope, as they have for more than a century. Wind moves through grasses, just as it did when Wright first imagined his experiment in organic living. The world beyond the valley has transformed beyond recognition. Wars fought and ended, cities risen and reshaped, technologies invented and rendered obsolete. Yet Taliesin remains, not frozen in the past, but anchored in continuity. The Gilded Age mansion that was too modern has become a testament to the endurance of vision. It teaches that architecture can be more than shelter or display. It can be philosophy made tangible. It reveals that even in the aftermath of unimaginable tragedy, creation can persist, and it reminds us that the most radical ideas are often those that align with something older and steadier than fashion or fortune, the land itself. In that alignment lies Taliesin's quiet victory, not over critics, nor over fire, nor even over time, but over irrelevance. It remains present, grounded, alive in its stillness, and as long as the hill cradles its walls and the valley opens before its windows, Taliesin will continue to tell its story, not loudly, not defiantly, but with the calm assurance of a house that has endured everything and still belongs.